Sunday school today. Ooh, there we go. Now I'll bring it down just a tad. We are in lesson 11 of our book. Today we'll be talking about, is Jesus God? What books should be in the Bible? And if I'm not mistaken, this lesson is right around 30 minutes. So there will be a 30-minute presentation. What I would like to see is if you have any questions about our previous lesson. Last week was part 2 of Did the New Testament Writers Tell the Truth? What we've seen so far in these lessons is, does truth exist? And the answer comes back yes. It's self-defeating to say that it doesn't exist. Does God exist? Yes, we've looked at the evidence. The cosmological argument, which deals with the beginning of the universe. The teleological argument, which deals with the design of the universe. The argument that comes from moral law, the fact that there is morality, that there is right and wrong, implies that there is a standard that is above that of human beings. Otherwise, right and wrong is simply a matter of your opinion versus my opinion. So, we may believe that Jews should not be exterminated, but Hitler did not have that particular view. So what makes our view superior to his? And of course, it would go to the fact that there is an objective moral law. Are miracles possible? We've looked at the fact that if there is a God that created everything, it's really not a jump to say that miracles can exist. But as we have mentioned several times, and even Frank Turek has alluded to, there is the argument of an open versus closed universe. One of the reasons science can be so arrogant, and I'll use the word, we can be arrogant too, but science can be so arrogant, and the reason they say things like follow the science or such as that is their view is based on a closed universe. In other words, the universe is as it exists, and it operates by a certain set of laws, and those laws can be objectively viewed, they can be examined, experiments can be made that can be replicated, and that's their way and their sole way of gaining truth. The problem is not with their method. The problem is with their assumption that it is a closed universe. We believe in an open universe, that there is a God that created everything, and that He created it to follow a certain set of rules, which of course is why science can find those rules and they can verify them. But that same God also at any time can reach inside that universe through His providence, through miracles, through whatever means He wishes, and He can make changes. He can work within the natural rules of the universe, or He could work totally supernaturally in order to accomplish things. So it's really not a big deal to talk about miracles if you already believe that God created everything. We have asked the question, is the New Testament true? And basically what he did is he established the text of the New Testament. And basically he says that we can trust the Bibles that we have today to be faithfully transmitted to us over the years. In other words, we have manuscripts going all the way back to the 1st century. We have, to the 2nd century that reflect the 1st century originals. We even have old versions of the Old Testament, only recently discovered in the 40s with the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we could go and we could see that the Hebrew text that has been delivered to us is accurate. Now, of course, there are always going to be little changes in manuscripts here or there, but the fact is you can trust the manuscripts of the Old and New Testament that they have been faithfully transmitted to us today. Then last week, actually the last 2 weeks, we've seen, did the New Testament writers tell the truth? And basically, he took us through 6 types of evidence. There is the early testimony of the New Testament. For example, the New Testament came out, the New Testament books had been written, even though they were not maybe assembled in the way they are today, in a way that if they were untrue, there were still eyewitnesses and early witnesses that could verify, yes, indeed, these are the things that happened, or no, these are false. But there were eyewitnesses, there were early witnesses. So those were the first type of. There is the embarrassing testimony. I mean, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Peter was given the keys of the kingdom of heaven. He was the one that first preached to the Jews. He was the one that first preached to the Gentiles. But yet Peter has some pretty embarrassing stuff in his background. So there is embarrassing testimony. Sometimes I have preached a lesson called The Wrongness of a Righteous Man. And it's on the life of Abraham. Have you ever noticed how many times that Abraham did not act in a faithful way? Abraham made all kinds of mistakes, but yet he was called the man of faith. He was called the father of the faithful. He is extolled in the Bible as a man for his obedience, but he was not perfect. So the Bible includes people, warts and all, when it comes to that. And that is just another witness. You don't put, if I was writing an autobiography, I would not put the most embarrassing moments of my life in that autobiography, or certainly the greatest failures of my life in that autobiography. That's just something people normally don't do. So there is embarrassing testimony. There is the excruciating testimony, as he gave it, because all of these men who wrote the Bible, wrote the New Testament, they were eyewitness testimony almost to the man. And as they wrote these things, many of them actually were condemned to death for it. Now, people all the time can become martyrs for things that are untrue. But he mentioned he knows of no one that becomes a martyr or that lays down their lives for things they know aren't true. You see what I'm saying? Here are people that witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. They were willing to go to the death to proclaim that message. I mean, you just look in the early chapters of Acts. We ought to obey God rather than men. You decide for yourselves who it's better to believe, God or man. So you have the excruciating testimony. You have the expected testimony, and quite frankly, I can't remember what that one was. Oh, here we go. It's prophecies from the Old Testament. It's what he talks about there when he talks about the expected testimony. There are so many prophecies of the Old Testament that come true in the New Testament. Jesus says that he was the fulfillment of the law, but he was also the fulfillment of the prophets. And you look at passages like Isaiah 53, which basically, if you didn't have the New Testament, you could just insert the name Jesus there instead of suffering servant or my servant, and you would have almost an identical description of what Jesus went through. I mean, there's, of course, more details that we learn in the New Testament. We even have more reasoning behind it. But you see, we have the expected testimony. There is the extra-biblical testimony. And here are the people that lived within 100 years of the New Testament books being written. There are all kinds of non-Christian and Christian writers that attested to the main events that we find in the New Testament. And then he mentions the enemy testimony. I don't know if he did any more than actually allude to it, if he even did that, but that would be number 7. I think I only told you he... there's more, by the way, in the book. Do you have... does anyone have a copy of the main book? Okay, there we go. All right, and we have a bill in the back. All right, there. Hold the big... The big book is much more detailed than the videos. That book, the black book. It is, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and if he gives 5 points here, he'll give 8 points in the book. So it's a lot more detailed. I have, those of you who have bought the workbook, and I've given you the teacher's book because all the answers are in there. I didn't want you to buy a $20 book and not have any answers in it, okay? These are good. These are good to go through. You can pretty much follow along, and this is exactly what he's giving in the videos. I mean, aside from the jokes and some of the personal anecdotes. But the 7th E is the enemy testimony. There were people who were enemies of Christianity, but by their testimony, they actually affirm its truth. So he even mentions that. What comments or questions do you have about that? Because we have exactly 30 minutes for the video. He does not in this study. I don't know if he does in the big book or not. Talk about quantum physics. There are a lot of interesting things about quantum physics. Quantum physicists have even postulated that the human consciousness is being uploaded into the universe. Now, that sounds really strange to us, but think about this for a moment. Could this be at least a mechanism, if not the mechanism, by which that God preserves who we are in the afterlife? Could this be a factor, or is it just totally miraculous what God does of preserving the soul or the human? Quantum physics kind of speculates into things such as that. It is by no means, by the way, though, a religious or a Christian discipline. Okay, but there are certainly some applications. Yes, sir. That's exactly right. And that's the way a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls... Oh, I'm sorry. What was your name again, sir? Jerry Anderson. Jerry and his wife were visiting from Reno today. It's good to have you with us. He mentioned that before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, people said that the material regarding Isaiah 53 was so accurate to what happened to Jesus, it must have been written after the cross. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they found ancient scrolls that predated the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So that's a good. All right, that pretty much is the review that we can afford to have and still watch the entire video. So it's right at 30 minutes. This is lesson 11. Oh, by the way, we're going to see lesson 12 next week, Lord willing. And then I'm going to try to curate maybe a couple of others of his videos for the rest of the month. And then in August, we're going to begin a study of the Holy Spirit. Those of you who've spoken to me privately, that seems to be your preference. We'll be looking at experiencing the power of the Holy Spirit. Who is the Holy Spirit? What does he do for us? And some other things related to that. All right, let's begin.